In the quiet farm country of 1963, an entire farmer family of 5 vanished from their home overnight. The Henderson family, a father, a mother, and 3 small children, were there one evening and gone the next, swallowed by the silence of the cornfields. For decades it was a ghost story, a wound that never healed. Then, 50 years later, their father's tractor was found rusting away in a forgotten, abandoned barn miles from their property. But this discovery made no sense. Official records claimed the tractor had been sold at auction decades before. Someone had lied. The tractor wasn't just a lost piece of farm equipment, it was evidence of a terrible secret. A secret suggesting the family didn't just disappear, they were erased. What truth was this town so desperate to keep buried with them? Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The air in the old Miller barn was thick with the ghosts of forgotten seasons. It tasted of dust and decay, of hay that had turned to powder and metal that had surrendered to rust. Light sliced through the warped boards in golden, hazy shafts, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. For 50 years, this place had been a tomb, sealed against the world, waiting for the demolition crew that was scheduled to arrive in less than a week. Clara Mason, at 58 years old, felt the weight of every one of those years pressing down on her. She wasn't supposed to be here. The town council had asked her, as a courtesy to her late father's memory, to do one final walkthrough of the condemned properties on the edge of town, just to be sure nothing of historical value was being lost. It was a meaningless gesture, a box-ticking exercise, but Clara had always been one to do a job right. Her father, Sheriff Thomas Mason, had taught her that. Do it right, or don't do it at all. She ran a hand over a stack of rotted feed sacks, her fingers coming away coated in grime. Everything was predictable, everything was decay. Then she saw it. In the deepest, darkest corner of the barn, a massive shape huddled under a canvas tarp so rotted it looked like a shroud woven from shadows and spiderwebs. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't felt so sharply since her days as a schoolteacher, pulled her forward. Her sensible shoes crunched on dried earth and shattered glass. With a deep breath that filled her lungs with the smell of old secrets, she grabbed a corner of the tarp. It resisted, then tore with a sound like a dry sigh, disintegrating in her hands and releasing a cloud of acrid dust that made her cough. And there it was, a tractor. A John Deere Model B, its iconic green paint now, a leprous patchwork of rust and faded glory. It was an old machine, a workhorse from another time. But it was the specific shade of that green, peeking out from under the rust, that sent a jolt through her heart. It was Henderson green. Everyone in town knew about the Hendersons. In 1963, when Clara was just a little girl of 8, they had vanished. Jacob and Evelyn, and their 3 children, 2 boys and a little girl. One day they were there, a fixture of the community, their laundry on the line and their cows in the field. The next, they were gone. The house was empty, the livestock unfed. No note. No trace. They had simply been erased from the world overnight. Her father had led the search. She remembered the tension in their house, the way her mother's hands were never still, constantly wringing a dish towel. She remembered her father coming home late, his face etched with a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than bone. They searched for weeks, then months, but found nothing. The Hendersons became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to children who stayed out after dark. Now, standing in front of this decaying machine, Clara felt a cold dread mix with a forgotten childhood fear. This tractor didn't belong here. The Miller farm was a good 5 miles from the old Henderson place. Her hand trembled as she reached for the tractor's cab. The metal was cold, unforgiving. She pulled herself up, her joints protesting. The seat was cracked leather, and the wheel was skeletal iron. Her eyes fell on the glove box, its door hanging slightly ajar. With a creak of protest, she pried it open. Inside, nestled in a bed of mouse droppings and desiccated leaves, was a single, small object. A child's woolen mitten. It was a faded red, a tiny thing that could have fit in the palm of her hand. Her breath caught in her throat. Stitched onto the cuff in clumsy, loving letters were two initials: A.H. Amelia Henderson. She had been 6 years old. Clara closed her eyes, and for a split second she could almost hear the laughter of a little girl, a phantom echo in the dead silence of the barn. This wasn't just a forgotten piece of equipment. It was a gravestone. It was a message. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she began searching for the serial number. Her father had shown her where to look on their own farm equipment, a lesson from a lifetime ago. She found the plate, obscured by a thick cake of grease and grime. Using the hem of her jacket, she scraped and rubbed until the stamped numbers were visible. She wrote them down in the small notebook she always carried in her purse, her handwriting shaky. Getting down from the tractor felt different. The barn no longer felt empty, it felt watched. She didn't bother looking at anything else. She turned and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, the little red mitten clutched in her hand, the numbers burning a hole in her notebook. The next morning she was at the county records office. The air inside smelled of old paper and lemon polish. A young clerk, a former student of hers, smiled warmly. "Mrs. Mason, what can I help you with?" Clara felt a strange reluctance to speak the words, as if saying them aloud would make it all real. She explained her discovery, leaving out the part about the mitten, and asked the clerk to look up the serial number. The hope, the small, fragile spark of it, was that it would lead somewhere, provide a clue, a new thread in a 50-year-old cold case. She wanted to prove her father's search hadn't been a failure. The clerk typed into her computer, the clicking of the keys unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Her brow furrowed. "That's odd," she muttered, before turning to a massive, leather-bound ledger from the pre-digital era. Clara's heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She watched the girl's finger trace a line of faded ink. Then the girl looked up, her expression a mixture of confusion and pity. "Mrs. Mason," she said softly, "I have the record right here. This tractor, serial number B19472, was part of the Henderson Farm liquidation auction. It was sold on December 4, 1963, to a farmer over in the next county." A wave of cold washed over Clara. It made no sense. She had seen the tractor with her own eyes. It was sitting in the Miller barn, had been for decades. But the official record, the black and white truth of history, said it was somewhere else entirely. The paper said one thing, the rusted metal said another. The contradiction was so stark, so impossible, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. Someone had lied. Someone, 50 years ago, had created a false record, a paper trail that led nowhere, while the real tractor, the evidence, was hidden away to rot in the dark. The news spread through the small town with the speed of a grass fire. It wasn't Clara who told it. It was the clerk, then the clerk's mother, then the entire morning coffee group at the diner. By evening her phone was ringing. It was Bill Peterson, the head of the town council and a man who had known her father well. His voice was smooth, friendly, but with an undertone of steel. "Clara, I heard about your find," he said, the word hanging in the air with disapproval. "A fascinating piece of local history, to be sure, but it's just an old tractor." "Bill, the records are wrong," Clara said, her voice firmer than she felt. "That tractor belonged to Jacob Henderson." There was a pause. "Your father, Tom, was the best sheriff this county ever had," Bill said, his tone shifting, becoming paternal, condescending. "He ran that investigation by the book. He closed the case. Are you saying he missed something? That he didn't do his job?" The unspoken threat was clear. "Stop. You are about to disgrace his name." "Some things, Clara," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "are better left buried. For everyone's sake. For your father's legacy." When she hung up the phone, Clara was trembling, but not with fear. It was with a cold, clear rage. He wasn't protecting her father's legacy. He was protecting a lie. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her father's old armchair, the worn leather cool against her skin. On the mantelpiece was a framed photograph of her mother, who had passed away 10 years ago. Her mother had been a quiet woman, but she had a spine of iron and a fierce belief in the truth. Clara looked at her smiling face, the gentle eyes that seemed to see right into her soul. She thought of the Henderson family, of little Amelia and her red mitten. 5 people who had been loved, who had laughed and worked and prayed, and who had been erased as if they were nothing more than a typo in a dusty ledger. She thought of her father, the good man she remembered, and the possibility that he had been forced to carry a terrible secret to his grave. Opening her journal, the same one her mother had given her, she picked up a pen. In the quiet lamplight of her lonely house, she made a silent promise, not to the town, not to the memory of her father, but to the ghost of her mother and the 5 souls lost in the dark. "I will find out what happened," she wrote, the words a vow etched into the page. "No matter what it costs, I will find the truth." The house was silent, but in that moment she had declared war. A war against 50 years of silence, against a town built on secrets, and against the ghosts that refused to stay buried. The vow Clara had made in the silence of her living room felt strong and righteous in the dark, but in the harsh light of the next day, it felt like a heavy stone she had to carry through the center of town. The change was subtle, but it was there. In the grocery store, conversations would halt when she walked down an aisle. Eyes that used to meet hers with a friendly nod now found something fascinating to study on a can of green beans. She felt the chill of her community turning its back on her, a collective shunning orchestrated by whispers she couldn't hear. It was a language she understood all too well. It was the town's way of enforcing its unspoken laws. Bill Peterson's warning hadn't been a suggestion, it was an order, and she was now paying the price for her disobedience. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold pocket in her chest that made it hard to breathe. It drove her back into the quiet refuge of her house, the same house she had grown up in, a place now filled with the ghosts of her own family. She found herself wandering into her parents' old bedroom, a room she had kept largely untouched. The air was still, smelling faintly of her mother's lavender sachets and her father's cedar shoe trees. It was in here, surrounded by their memory, that the ghosts of the Hendersons began to stir. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the chenille bedspread soft beneath her hands, and let herself fall back in time. She was 8 years old again, her world a small, safe kingdom bordered by the elementary school and the creek behind her house. The news of the Hendersons' disappearance had arrived not as a single shocking blow, but as a creeping dread that seeped into everything. It was in the worried frowns of her parents, the hushed, urgent phone calls her father took at all hours, the way her mother would suddenly pull her into a tight hug for no reason at all. She remembered her father coming home after days of searching, his uniform streaked with mud and his face a mask of grim exhaustion. He never spoke about what they were looking for, not to her. But she saw the weight of it in the slump of his shoulders, a weight so heavy it seemed to be crushing him from the inside out. The town mythologized that search. They said Sheriff Mason and his men had scoured every inch of that county for weeks, turning over every stone. They said he'd nearly worked himself to death trying to find them. That was the story everyone told. It was the story that had made him a local hero. It was the story she had always believed. Feeling adrift and isolated, Clara began to search for something, anything that might ground her. She wasn't looking for a clue, not consciously. She was looking for a connection to her mother, for some of her quiet strength. She pulled a heavy wooden recipe box from a shelf in the kitchen pantry. It was filled with her mother's handwritten cards, stained with vanilla and butter. As she sifted through recipes for apple pie and pot roast, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. It was a rectangle of brittle, yellowed paper folded into a tight square. A newspaper clipping. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump. Unfolding it carefully, she saw it was a small article from the local paper, dated just a few days after the family had vanished. The headline was simple: "Search continues for missing family." But it wasn't the article that made her stop breathing. It was the note scrawled on the back, in her mother's elegant looping script. 2 words. "Check the well." Clara stared at the handwriting, her mind reeling. Check the well. It was a command, a secret message. Her mother had suspected something specific, something she couldn't say out loud. Why? Why would a sheriff's wife write a cryptic note and hide it in a recipe box? A dark, ugly thought began to form, a thought so disloyal it felt like a betrayal. Maybe the note wasn't a clue for someone else to find. Maybe it was a reminder for herself of something she couldn't trust her own husband with. A cold sickness coiled in Clara's stomach. The image of her father as a tireless hero began to fracture. What if he wasn't the man she remembered? What if he was the reason her mother had to hide her suspicions in a box of recipes? The hope ignited by finding a clue was instantly extinguished by the terrible possibility of what it might mean. She needed more than just a note, she needed the full story. The next morning she walked into the town archive, a dusty, hallowed space that smelled of history. The woman behind the counter was Ruth Callahan, a meticulous archivist in her early 60s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. Clara had known Ruth for years, though they were acquaintances more than friends. "Ruth," she began, her voice low, "I'm doing some family research. I was hoping to look at some old newspapers from 1963. Ruth's gaze was steady, knowing. The whole town knew what Clara was doing. But instead of the coldness Clara had come to expect, Ruth simply nodded. "Of course. Let's see what we can find." The quiet offer of help, the simple act of collegial kindness, was a lifeline. For the first time in days, Clara didn't feel completely alone. A fragile sense of hope returned. Maybe she wasn't crazy. Maybe the truth was findable. Ruth led her to an old microfilm reader in a dim corner. Together, they scrolled through the grainy black-and-white images of the past. They found the article from the clipping easily. It said what she already knew. The search was ongoing. The town was praying. But Clara urged Ruth to keep going, to go forward a few more days. "There has to be more," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Ruth. They scrolled past advertisements for new model cars and reports on the church bake sale, and then they found it, an article published 3 days after the first one. It was short, barely a column inch, tucked away near the back of the page. The headline read, "Henderson Search Concluded." Clara leaned closer, her eyes scanning the text, her blood turning to ice. The article quoted her father, Sheriff Thomas Mason, stating that after a thorough and exhaustive search of the area, no trace of the family had been found, and that the official search was being called off. He urged the public to come forward with any information, but made it clear the active, large-scale operation was over. Clara sat back in her chair as if she'd been struck. 3 days, she said, her voice a strangled whisper. "That's not possible." Ruth looked at her, her face pale in the glow of the screen. "Clara, what is it?" "Everyone said they searched for weeks," Clara breathed, the words catching in her throat. "My father, the whole town. The story was that they searched for weeks. 3 days. 3 days wasn't a search for a missing family of 5. It wasn't an exhaustive effort. It was a gesture. It was a performance. It was a lie." Staring at the cold official text on the screen, a new, more horrifying truth began to settle over her. Her father, the town hero, hadn't just failed to find the Hendersons. For reasons she couldn't begin to comprehend, he had barely even looked. The lie was a living thing now. It sat in the room with Clara, a foul presence that tainted every memory she had of her father. 3 days. The words echoed in the hollow space where her respect for him used to be. The story of his heroic, exhaustive search was a fiction, a carefully constructed myth to comfort a town that didn't want to look too closely at the darkness in its own backyard. She felt a profound and dizzying sense of betrayal, not just by her father, but by the entire community that had peddled the lie for 50 years. She saw his face in her mind, not the kind, steady father of her childhood, but a stranger, a man capable of participating in a cover-up so vast it had swallowed a family whole. What could have possibly been so terrible that it made a good man abandon his duty? The question was a poison, seeping into the foundations of her life, making her doubt everything she thought she knew. That evening, as a cold autumn rain began to streak the windows, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, intrusive, cutting through the heavy silence of her home. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the beveled glass of the front door, she saw the silhouette of a tall, stooped man holding an umbrella. She opened it to find Gerald Whitmore standing on her porch, his face arranged in a mask of gentle concern. Now, in his 70s, he was still a handsome man, with a full head of silver hair and a politician's easy smile. He had been a young deputy back in 1963, her father's right hand. Now he was the county commissioner, the most powerful man in town. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that had calmed anxious crowds and won countless elections. "I hope I'm not intruding. I saw your light on and thought I'd stop by. This rain is something, isn't it?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking his umbrella onto her doormat and filling her small entryway with the scent of wet wool and expensive, cloying cologne. He was invading her space, claiming it as his own. "I've been worried about you," he said, turning to face her. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, held hers. "All this talk about the tractor, it's stirring up old ghosts." He walked into her living room and settled into her father's armchair, as if he had every right to be there. The casual ownership of the act sent a chill down Clara's spine. "Your father, Thomas," he began, leaning forward, "was a good man, the best. He did everything he could to find those poor people. Everything. It broke his heart that he couldn't." Clara stood stiffly by the doorway, her arms crossed. "The search only lasted 3 days, Gerald." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, passed through his eyes before the smile returned, wider this time. "It was a different time, Clara. We didn't have the resources we have now. 3 days of searching then was like 3 months of searching today. We had every able-bodied man in the county out there." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a soft cloth and his wire-rimmed glasses. As he spoke, he began to polish the lenses in slow, deliberate circles. It was a habit of his she'd seen 100 times, a folksy, professorial mannerism. Tom made the right call. It was a dead end. Continuing the search would have given people false hope. He did it to protect the community, to let them heal. He was lying. Clara felt it with a certainty that was as solid as the floor beneath her feet. The polishing of the glasses wasn't a mannerism, it was a shield. It was what he did when he was fabricating the truth. He was doing it now. "Don't rewrite history, Clara," he said, his voice dropping, losing its warmth and gaining a hard, dangerous edge. "You're going to tarnish a good man's memory. Your father's memory. He was a hero." He placed his glasses back on, the lenses now gleaming, and the look he gave her was no longer friendly. It was a command. He stood up, the visit abruptly over. "You're a sensible woman, a respected woman. Let it be. Let the past rest." At the door he placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "It's for the best. For everyone." Then he was gone, leaving behind the smell of his cologne and a silence that felt heavier and more threatening than before. The mask of community concern had slipped, and for a terrifying moment she had seen the face of the monster underneath. His visit wasn't an act of kindness. It was a threat, delivered with a smile. The next day, the fear from his visit had crystallized into a hard knot of anger. He had threatened her father's legacy to keep her quiet. He had sat in her father's chair and lied to her face. It was a mistake. He had underestimated her. She called Ruth. "I need to see the full investigation file," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "My father's case notes, witness statements, anything you have from 1963. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Ruth's voice, quiet and worried. "Clara, are you sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure," Clara said. When she arrived at the archive, the atmosphere had changed. The welcoming quiet was gone, replaced by a tense, unwelcoming silence. Ruth wouldn't meet her eye. "I'm sorry, Clara," she mumbled, staring at her computer screen. "The Henderson case file, it seems to have been misplaced. We've looked everywhere." Misplaced. The word was a punch to the gut. It was a bureaucratic lie, as thin and transparent as Whitmore's smile. It meant the files weren't lost, they were sealed, hidden. Whitmore had gotten to them. His power reached even here, into this quiet sanctuary of history, and had erased the past with a phone call. She had been cut off. The official channels, the paths of truth and due process, were now closed to her. Clara felt a surge of helpless fury, followed by a wave of cold, sharp fear. This was no longer just about stirring up old gossip. She had kicked a hornet's nest, and the hornets were powerful and knew exactly who she was. She walked out of the archive into the cold afternoon, the feeling of being watched now a certainty. The town no longer felt like home. It felt like a cage. That night she sat with Ruth in her small, cluttered kitchen, the two of them surrounded by stacks of books and the smell of brewing tea. "He threatened you, didn't he?" Ruth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clara just nodded, the memory of Whitmore's grip on her shoulder still vivid. "The files are gone, Ruth. He's shutting it all down." Ruth looked at her hands, then up at Clara, a new resolve in her eyes. "Then we don't use the front door," she said. "Clara, this is dangerous. If they're willing to hide 50-year-old files, what else are they willing to do?" The fear was real, tangible. It sat between them at the kitchen table. "From now on," Ruth said, her voice firm, "we use a check-in system. If you go anywhere to look for something, you call me when you get there, and you call me when you leave. If I don't hear from you, I call the state police, not the local boys." The state. This small act of planning, this admission of genuine danger, solidified their alliance. The hope of having an ally bloomed again in Clara's chest, a small, warm light in the growing darkness. Desperate for a different kind of sanctuary, a place Whitmore's influence couldn't taint, Clara found herself at the old First Baptist Church a few days later. She told the elderly pastor, Reverend Hines, that she was looking for old Sunday school records for a family history project. He led her down to the musty church basement, a catacomb of forgotten furniture, boxes of hymnals, and the faint, sweet smell of communion wine. It was in a dusty cardboard box labeled "Lost Found" that she saw it, a heavy black leather-bound book. On the inside cover, in elegant gold leaf, were the words, "The Holy Bible, property of the Henderson family." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The pages were thin, almost translucent with age. And then she saw it. Tucked inside the Book of Psalms was a dried, pressed wildflower, and beneath it, a single verse was underlined in faded blue ink. "And ye shall know the truth," the verse read, "and the truth shall set you free." Clara ran her finger over the words, a powerful wave of emotion washing over her. It felt like a message sent across 50 years of silence. It was Evelyn Henderson's voice, her faith, her desperate prayer. In that dusty, forgotten basement, holding the family's sacred book, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose, a conviction so strong it chased the fear away. This was more than a mystery now. It was a moral imperative. As she stood to leave, her heart filled with this fragile, precious hope, she heard a sound from the sanctuary upstairs. A soft, distinct footstep on the old wooden floorboards. Then another. Someone was in the church. But Reverend Hines had told her he was leaving for the afternoon, that she would be locking up. She stood frozen in the dim basement light, clutching the heavy Bible to her chest, listening. The footsteps above stopped directly over her head. Silence. She wasn't alone. She was being watched. The silence in the church basement was absolute, yet deafening. Clara stood frozen, clutching the Henderson Bible so tightly her knuckles were white. Every nerve ending screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the damp, cold concrete floor. The footstep upstairs hadn't been a random creak of an old building settling. It had been deliberate, measured. It was the sound of someone who didn't want to be heard, someone who was hunting. She imagined Gerald Whitmore's smiling face, the deadness in his eyes. He had her blocked at the archives, ostracized in the town, and now he was cornering her in the house of God. The hope that had soared in her chest just moments before plummeted into a pit of icy terror. The underlined verse in the Bible felt less like a promise now, and more like an epitaph. "The truth shall set you free." But what if first it got you killed? She held her breath, straining to hear, but there was nothing. Only the frantic thumping of her own heart. Was he waiting for her to come up the stairs? Was he trying to trap her down here? The basement, once a dusty sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. She had to move. She couldn't let him corner her. Slipping off her shoes, she moved in her stocking feet across the grimy floor to a small, high window, its glass clouded with decades of filth. It was too high to climb through, but it offered a sliver of a view of the side alley. Peering out, her heart hammering against her ribs, she saw him. Not Whitmore. It was a man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered and wearing a dark jacket, standing by a car parked across the street, staring directly at the church's entrance. He wasn't trying to hide. He was just watching, waiting. It was a clear, unmistakable message of intimidation. They knew where she was. They were tracking her every move. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was surveillance. She felt violated, stripped of her safety and her privacy. Anger, hot and fierce, burned through her fear. This was her town. This was her home. She would not be hunted like an animal in her own streets. Back in the safety of Ruth's kitchen that evening, the story of the man outside the church tumbling out of her, the two women decided their strategy had to change. "We're done with official records," Ruth declared, her voice a low, determined hum as she paced the small room. "They control the paper trail, so we have to find something they don't know exists." She stopped pacing and turned to Clara. Farmers, especially back then, were meticulous record keepers. They didn't always trust banks. They kept their own books. "We need to find Jacob Henderson's farm ledger." The idea was a spark in the dark. It was tangible. A physical object they could search for. But where would a man hide something that important? The Henderson farm had been sold off and subdivided decades ago. The old house was gone, replaced by a row of neat, soulless suburban homes. But the land, the old farmland itself, still held secrets. Ruth remembered something from an old property survey map. "The grain silo," she said, her eyes lighting up. "It was the one structure they didn't tear down. It's on a piece of land that's still undeveloped, owned by the county now. It's been sealed for 50 years. Getting access was a risk." Ruth, in a move of quiet rebellion that made Clara's heart swell with gratitude, called in a favor from a cousin in the county maintenance department. She claimed they needed to do an inspection for a historical preservation grant, a lie that was thin but plausible enough to get them a key and a promise that no one would be told. The next afternoon, under a sky the color of a dull gray slate, they drove out to the old Henderson land. The silo stood like a rusted metal giant against the horizon, a lonely monument to a forgotten tragedy. The air was thick with the threat of a coming storm. The lock on the heavy metal door was rusted shut, and it took both of their weights, grunting and straining, to force it open. The sound of the metal screeching open was like a scream from the past. The air that rushed out was stale and hot, thick with the ghosts of 50 harvests. Inside it was cavernous and dark. Shafts of dim light pierced the gloom through cracks in the metal roof. It smelled of rust, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of rotted grain. "We'll have to search every inch," Ruth said, her voice echoing in the vast, empty space. They started at the bottom, sifting through debris, their hands quickly covered in grime. Hours passed. The sky outside grew darker, the wind beginning to howl around the silo, making the metal walls groan and shudder. Clara felt a growing sense of desperation. What if they were wrong? What if this was another dead end? Another fool's errand that would only draw more unwanted attention to them? Just as she was about to give up hope, her hand brushed against a loose piece of metal sheeting inside an old, empty feed bin. It was out of place. Tugging on it, she found it covered a small, hollow space. And inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound book, the Henderson Farm Ledger. A jolt of pure, triumphant adrenaline shot through her. They had found it. They had beaten Whitmore. Sitting on the dusty floor, with the storm now raging outside, they opened it. Jacob Henderson's handwriting was neat, precise. Page after page detailed crop yields, equipment costs, household expenses. It was the ordinary, daily life of a family, captured in ink. Then they found what they were looking for. Near the back there was a section titled Debts, Accounts. And there it was, an entry dated from the summer of 1963. A loan for a substantial amount of money for seed and new equipment parts. Next to the entry, in the column marked Paid, the space was blank. Instead, there was a note. Owed, never paid. And the signature at the bottom, authorizing the loan on behalf of the County Development Fund, was unmistakable. 2 elegantly scrawled initials, G.W. Gerald Whitmore. This was it, the motive, a financial dispute that had escalated. It was the proof they needed, the first solid piece of evidence that tied Whitmore directly to a conflict with the Henderson family just before they vanished. Hope, real and powerful, surged through Clara. For a moment she believed they had won. That was when the storm broke in earnest. A deafening crack of thunder shook the silo to its foundations, followed instantly by a sound like a freight train as rain began to hammer against the metal roof. A gust of wind slammed the heavy door shut, plunging them into near-total darkness. The latch, rusted and weak, clicked loudly into place. They were trapped. Panic flared in Clara's chest, hot and sharp. They scrambled to the door, pushing against it with all their might, but it wouldn't budge. They were locked in a metal drum in the middle of a violent thunderstorm. As she shoved her shoulder against the door again, her foot slipped on a patch of wet, slick grain. She went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening crack of bone. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her leg. She cried out, collapsing to the floor, the precious ledger falling from her grasp. Lying there in the dark, her ankle screaming in agony, the victory of finding the ledger felt like a bitter joke. They had found the truth, only to be entombed with it. They had no choice. Ruth, her face a pale mask of fear in the gloom, had to use her cell phone to call for help. A call that would bring the sheriff's department. A call that would alert the entire town, and Gerald Whitmore, that they had found something they were never meant to find. As they waited in the dark, the roar of the storm their only companion, Ruth turned to Clara, her voice trembling. "My uncle," she said, the words barely audible over the rain. "He was a deputy back then, my Uncle Robert. He was part of your father's search party." Clara stared at her, confused by the sudden confession. "He always said they looked everywhere," Ruth continued, her voice cracking. "He told us stories about it for years, how they never gave up hope." She took a shaky breath. "He lied, didn't he? He was part of it. He stood by and let everyone believe that story." The betrayal on Ruth's face was a mirror of what Clara felt for her own father. In that moment, the fight became personal for Ruth, too. It was no longer just about a town's secret. It was about her own family's honor, her own family's lies. The lines were no longer clear. The enemy wasn't just a corrupt official. It was the quiet complicity of good people, the silent compromises of their own families. As the distant wail of a siren grew louder, cutting through the storm, Clara looked at the ledger lying in the dust, and a new, chilling thought settled in. This wasn't just about a debt. A man like Whitmore wouldn't erase a family over a loan. This was just the beginning. The ledger was just the first secret. What other, darker truths was this town hiding? The rescue from the silo was a humiliating public spectacle. The flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruiser cut through the stormy darkness, illuminating Clara's pale, pain-stricken face as two deputies helped her into the back of a car. One of the deputies, a young man with a nervous energy, avoided her gaze, focusing instead on her swollen, grotesquely angled ankle. The other, older and heavier, treated the Henderson ledger, which Ruth had insisted on bringing with them, with a theatrical disinterest that was more insulting than any open hostility. The story they gave, that they were history buffs caught in the storm, was so thin it was transparent, and no one pretended to believe it. News of their accident was all over town before Clara's ankle was even set in a cast at the small local clinic. The message from Whitmore, though unspoken, was delivered with brutal efficiency. "I know what you've found. You are clumsy, foolish old women, and I am always one step ahead." The victory of finding the ledger had dissolved into the bitter ashes of public ridicule and physical pain. Confined to her house, her leg propped up on a tower of pillows, Clara felt a crushing sense of defeat. The walls of her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent a jolt of paranoia through her. They were watching her house, she was sure of it. The town's silence was no longer passive, it was aggressive, suffocating. People she had known her entire life now crossed the street to avoid her porch. The ledger, their one solid piece of evidence, had been logged and filed away by the sheriff's department, which meant it was now in a drawer in Whitmore's pocket, as good as buried. Her quest for the truth had cost her her mobility, her reputation, and her peace of mind. She was losing. The emotional low point was a gaping maw, threatening to swallow her whole. It was Ruth, steady and undeterred, who refused to let the darkness win. Now, driven by the betrayal of her own family's lies, she became Clara's legs. She arrived each morning with groceries, a thermos of strong coffee, and a fierce determination. "If we can't trust the records," Ruth said, setting a steaming mug on Clara's side table, "then we have to find a record that can't be burned or buried. We have to find a memory." They spent days on the phone, poring over old phone books and church directories, making a list of anyone still alive who would have been an adult in 1963, anyone who might remember something, anything, about the night the Henderson family vanished. Most calls ended with a curt hang-up or a fearful, whispered, "I can't talk about this." The wall of silence erected 50 years ago was still standing, solid and impenetrable. The fear Whitmore had instilled back then had deep roots. But then, a flicker of light. An old woman on the outskirts of town, Martha Gable, who was now bedridden in a nursing home, agreed to speak with them. She had worked as a waitress at the town diner back then. When Ruth and Clara arrived, they found her propped up in bed, her body frail but her eyes as sharp and clear as glass. "I remember the Hendersons," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Jacob would bring the whole family in on Sunday after church. Such lovely children." She paused, her gaze turning inward, back across the decades. "I remember the night they went missing. Not the exact date, but the feel of it. There was a storm that night, just like the one you girls got caught in." She looked at them. "And I remember hearing a sound. It was late, after my shift. A tractor. A loud one, heading out of town on the old Miller Road. It was so late for a farmer to be working. It struck me as odd. It was a small detail, a thread so thin it could barely be seen, but it was there. A tractor, late at night, on the road leading to the abandoned barn where the Hendersons' tractor had been found. It was a connection. A surge of hope, fragile but real, returned to Clara. They weren't just chasing ghosts, they were on a real trail. Bolstered by this small victory, they visited another name on their list, Earl Peterson, a former farmhand who had worked for one of the Hendersons' neighbors. They found him sitting on the porch of his small, run-down house, a tarnished oxygen tank hissing beside him. He was a whisper of a man, his skin like parchment, his hands twisted by arthritis. At first, he refused to speak, shaking his head, his eyes darting fearfully towards the road. But Clara spoke to him gently, not of evidence or investigations, but of the Hendersons. Of Evelyn's kindness, of Jacob's strong hands, of the children's laughter echoing across the fields. She spoke of doing right by their memory. Slowly, painfully, the old man's wall of fear began to crumble. Tears welled in his pale, clouded eyes. "I was just a boy," he rasped, his breath catching. "I saw it. I saw them." He told them how he'd been woken that night by the rumble of the tractor. Hiding behind the curtains in his bedroom, he had seen men, 2 of them, moving the Hendersons' tractor and another piece of farm equipment. They weren't hiding, they were working under the glare of truck headlights, moving with a calm, efficient purpose. They took the equipment, he said, and drove it down the Miller Road. "One of the men," he whispered, his voice trembling, "was Deputy Whitmore. He had seen Gerald Whitmore, a lawman, stealing the property of a missing family in the dead of night. It was a bombshell, a direct eyewitness account placing Whitmore at the scene of the crime. "Will you sign a statement, Earl?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. "Will you tell them what you saw?" The old man looked at her, and in his eyes she saw 50 years of fear at war with a lifetime of guilt. He gave a single slow nod. "It's time," he breathed. "It's long past time." The elation was breathtaking. This was it. This was the key that would unlock the whole conspiracy. They had a motive, and now they had an eyewitness. Justice, after 50 long years, finally felt within reach. They agreed to come back the next morning with a tape recorder and a notary. As they drove away, Clara felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in weeks. The pain in her ankle seemed to recede, overshadowed by the triumphant surge of hope. But the universe of their investigation was cruel and capricious. The emotional high was a precipice, and they were about to be thrown off it. The call came the next morning, just as they were preparing to leave. It was Earl's daughter. Her voice was flat, hollow with shock. "He's gone," she said. "My father, he passed away in his sleep last night. The doctor said his heart just gave out." The news struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She sank onto a kitchen chair, the phone slipping from her hand. Gone. Their witness, their proof, their hope, gone. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. The official cause would be natural, his old, tired heart simply stopping. But Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it wasn't a coincidence. Whitmore had found out. Somehow, he had heard that they had spoken to Earl, and he had acted. Maybe he had paid the old man a visit, a conversation that had literally scared him to death. They would never be able to prove it. The perfect crime. Their victory had lasted less than 12 hours. Despair washed over her, heavier and more profound than ever before. She felt like she was dishonoring her father's memory, not by digging for the truth, but by failing so miserably. She had stirred up the past only to get an old man killed and accomplish nothing. The guilt was a heavy shroud. That afternoon, she asked Ruth to drive her to the cemetery. She hobbled on her crutches across the manicured grass to her parents' gravesite, the granite headstone cold and impassive under her touch. She sank to the damp ground, heedless of the pain in her ankle or the chill in the air. "Dad," she whispered to the stone, the wind whipping the word away. "What did you do? Why did you let this happen?" There was no answer, only the rustle of the autumn leaves. She looked at her mother's name etched beside his. Check the well. Her mother had known something was wrong. Her father had participated in a lie. Was she destroying the memory of a good man who had been trapped, or exposing a bad man who had hidden behind a uniform? The two possibilities warred within her, tearing her apart. "I just want the truth," she whispered, her voice breaking, the tears finally coming. "I just need to know what really happened to them." As she sat there, lost in her grief and confusion, she didn't see the dark car parked on the road at the edge of the cemetery, a lone figure behind the wheel, watching her every move. She thought she had hit rock bottom. She had no idea how much further she still had to fall. The day after Earl Peterson's funeral was gray and oppressive, the sky a low-hanging blanket of damp wool. The grief and guilt had settled deep into Clara's bones, a constant, wearying ache that was worse than the throbbing in her ankle. She felt utterly exposed, as if the walls of her house had been stripped away, leaving her vulnerable to the cold, watching eyes of the town. That morning, when she hobbled out to her mailbox, she found it. An envelope with no stamp and no return address, just her name printed in stark, block letters. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of cheap, lined paper. On it were 5 words, assembled from letters cut out of newspapers and magazines, a chaotic ransom note style that made her stomach clench. "Stop, or you'll end up like them." The threat was no longer veiled in polite warnings or political maneuvering. It was naked, brutal, and terrifyingly direct. It was a promise. She stumbled back into her house, her heart a wild bird beating against her ribs, and locked the door, the flimsy bolt feeling useless against the evil that was now seeping in under her door. The note broke something in her. For 24 hours, she surrendered to the fear. She didn't answer the phone. She sat in the dark, the curtains drawn, jumping at every sound. The memory of Earl Peterson's terrified face was burned into her mind. Whitmore wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was a man who could directly or indirectly make people die. And she was next. This, she thought, is what it must have felt like for the Hendersons in their final moments. The realization that the people you trusted, the authorities sworn to protect you, were the very monsters you should be running from. It was a profound, soul-crushing despair. She was an old woman with a broken ankle and a ghost story, and she was fighting a monster who had held a town in his grip for half a century. It was an impossible fight. For a full day she considered giving up, burning the ledger, and letting the ghosts of the past stay buried. But then, as she sat huddled in her father's armchair, the rage returned. It was a slow-burning ember at first, then a roaring flame. He had threatened her. He had called her a fool, sat in her father's chair, and lied. He had terrorized an old man into his grave. And now he thought a cheap, cowardly note would be enough to make her run and hide. He was wrong. The fear was still there, a cold snake coiling in her gut, but now it was overshadowed by a righteous fury. He was not going to win. She would not let him erase another family, even if it was just their memory. She called Ruth, her voice low and steady again, all trace of the previous day's terror gone. "He threatened me, Ruth. Directly this time." She read the note aloud. The silence on the other end was heavy. "Clara, this has gone too far," Ruth finally said, her voice tight with fear. "We need to go to the state police, now." "And tell them what?" Clara countered, a bitter laugh escaping her. "That a powerful county commissioner I have no concrete evidence against sent me an anonymous, untraceable note after I was caught breaking into a sealed county building? They'll think I'm a hysterical old woman. They'll call Whitmore, he'll laugh it off, and then we'll be in even more danger. No, we can't trust anyone." It was a reckless decision, born of a deep and now ingrained distrust of authority, a decision an audience might scream at her for making. She was choosing to stay in the ring with a killer, alone. "We have to be smarter," Clara insisted. "We have to find something undeniable, something he can't bury." They decided to double down on their safety protocols. They now traveled everywhere together. Their check-in calls became coded. "I'm going to the library to check out that history book," meant Clara had arrived safely. "I think I'll make a pot roast for dinner," meant she was home and the doors were locked. It was the language of people at war, a small act of defiance that made them feel slightly less powerless. Their new hope came from a simple, logical idea of Ruth's. "The children," she said one afternoon, as they sat poring over old maps. "The Henderson children." Amelia, David, and Jacob Jr. They were school-aged. Did they just stop showing up to class? It was a brilliant, overlooked detail. Getting the school records from 50 years ago proved to be a bureaucratic nightmare, but Ruth was persistent. She finally found the attendance logs for the fall of 1963 stored in a damp box in the high school's basement. And there it was, in crisp black and white. For the week leading up to their disappearance, the Henderson children had perfect attendance. The day after they vanished, and for every day after that, their names were marked with a simple, unquestioning "ah" for absent. There were no notes, no phone calls from their parents, and most importantly, no official withdrawal from the school district. A family planning to leave, to start a new life somewhere else, would have formally unenrolled their children. The Hendersons hadn't. Their disappearance hadn't been planned. It had been sudden, violent, and absolute. They had been there one day, and ripped out of existence the next. This small, sad detail, the string of A's next to their names, was a powerful testament to the crime. It was another piece of the puzzle, a small hope that the truth could still be pieced together. That evening, wanting to get out of the house but still wary of the town, Clara asked Ruth to drive her out on the country roads. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the harvested cornfields, Clara drove, trying to clear her head. The rain started again, a light drizzle that quickly turned into a blinding downpour. She was on a winding, narrow road a few miles from town, the wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. As she came around a sharp bend, she saw a set of headlights swerving directly into her lane. She slammed on the brakes. The pedal went straight to the floor, soft and useless. There was nothing there. The car screamed as she yanked the emergency brake, the tires losing their grip on the slick, wet asphalt. The world became a terrifying blur of spinning trees and gray sky as the car slid sideways, heading directly for a deep, waterlogged ditch. At the last possible second, the tires caught on a patch of gravel, and the car jerked to a violent halt, mere inches from the edge. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain drumming on the roof and their own ragged, panicked breathing. The other car was gone. It hadn't stopped. It hadn't even slowed down. "He cut the brake lines," Clara whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "He tried to kill us. There was no other explanation." The anonymous note had been the warning. This was the follow-through. The emotional terror of that moment was absolute. He had escalated from threats to direct, physical violence. He had tried to murder her. It was in the stunned, terrified silence that followed that Ruth noticed something had fallen from the Henderson ledger, which had been tossed from the back seat onto the floor. It was a folded piece of paper tucked deep inside the back cover. They had missed it before. With trembling hands, Clara opened it. It wasn't another account sheet. It was a map. A hand-drawn map of the county, sketched by Jacob Henderson himself. On it, he had marked his own farm, but he had also circled 5 other locations. 5 other old barns, scattered across the county. One of them was the Miller barn, where she had found the tractor. But there were 4 more. The realization hit them with the force of the near crash. This wasn't about one tractor. This wasn't about one barn. This was bigger. This was a network. Whatever secret Whitmore was protecting, it was vast, and it was hidden in pieces all over the county, and they were holding the treasure map. The near-fatal crash changed the texture of their fear. It was no longer a shadowy paranoia or a vague sense of being watched. It was the visceral memory of useless brakes and spinning trees, the sickening lurch of the car as it slid towards the abyss. Death was no longer a hypothetical consequence. It had brushed against them on that rainy road, close enough for them to feel its cold breath. Whitmore wasn't just hiding a financial crime from 50 years ago. He was an active, present-day threat, a man willing to commit murder to protect his secrets. This realization was both terrifying and clarifying. They were no longer just solving a mystery. They were in a fight for their lives. The map, discovered in the chaotic aftermath, felt less like a clue and more like a weapon, the only one they had in a war they were losing badly. It was their last, desperate hope. They decided to investigate the closest marked location on Jacob Henderson's map first. It indicated an old, dilapidated barn down by the river bend, a place that had been abandoned even back in the 60s. It was a reckless, desperate move, a decision made against every instinct for self-preservation. Going to another isolated, forgotten location was walking directly into the lion's den, and they both knew it. But the alternative, sitting and waiting for Whitmore to try again, was even more terrifying. They had to push forward. They had to find whatever it was Jacob Henderson had deemed important enough to mark on his map. Under the cover of a moonless, overcast night, with Clara's heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Ruth drove them out in her own car, a vehicle they prayed hadn't been tampered with. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror sent a fresh wave of panic through Clara. They parked a quarter-mile away and approached the barn on foot, Clara leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, every step an agony of pain and fear. The barn was a skeletal ruin, its roof caved in, its walls leaning at a precarious angle. The air inside was thick with the smell of river mud, rot, and the musky scent of animals that had long since taken shelter there. Using the weak beams of their flashlights, they began to search. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rotting floorboards and debris. It felt hopeless. What could possibly have survived 50 years in a place so exposed to the elements? But Jacob Henderson had been a smart man. He wouldn't have marked this place for no reason. Remembering the hidden compartment in the silo, Clara began to look for things that were out of place. Her flashlight beam fell on a stack of old rusted milk cans in a corner, covered in cobwebs and filth. They seemed too deliberately arranged. With Ruth's help, she began moving them, the metal groaning in protest. Behind the last can, tucked into a recess in the stone foundation, was a metal box. It was an old-fashioned lunchbox, the kind workmen used to carry, its painted surface almost entirely consumed by rust. With a shared, trembling breath, Clara pried open the rusted clasp. The hope that flared in her chest was so intense it was painful. Inside, protected from the damp by a layer of wax paper, was a small stack of photographs. They were black and white family portraits of the Hendersons. Jacob, tall and proud, with his arm around Evelyn. The 3 children, scrubbed and smiling, posing stiffly for the camera. A picture of little Amelia, holding a kitten, her face a sunbeam of pure joy. Seeing their faces, so full of life and promise, brought a fresh wave of grief. These weren't just names in a cold case file. They were real people, a family full of love, and their lives had been stolen. Tucked behind the photos was one last picture, a candid shot of the whole family, laughing together on a picnic blanket. On the back, in Evelyn's beautiful script, was a date. September 3rd, 1963. Last day. Clara stared at the date, her blood running cold. That was the day before they vanished. This picture, this happy, ordinary moment, was the last record of them being alive. It was undeniable proof that they had been there, alive and well, right up until the moment they disappeared. They hadn't run away. They hadn't planned to leave. They had been taken. This lunchbox was a time capsule, a final message from a doomed family. As Clara clutched the photograph, a sudden, blinding light filled the barn. She and Ruth spun around, their hearts leaping into their throats. A powerful set of headlights was shining directly into the barn from the laneway, pinning them in the glare like frightened animals. A car door slammed shut. A figure emerged from the blinding light, a silhouette that was tall and stooped and achingly familiar. It was Gerald Whitmore. "Looking for something, ladies?" His voice, amplified by the cavernous space, was no longer smooth or charming. It was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. He walked slowly towards them, a heavy tire iron dangling loosely from one hand. The pretense was over. The politician's mask was gone, and what was left was purely predatory. "You should have listened to me, Clara," he said, his eyes glinting in the harsh light. "You should have let the past rest." Panic, raw and absolute, seized Clara. There was nowhere to run. She looked at Ruth, and in her friend's wide, terrified eyes, she saw her own fear reflected. They were trapped. They were going to die here, in this forgotten ruin, and become just another part of the town's dark secret. Whitmore took another step towards them, raising the tire iron, and then, in a desperate last-ditch act of defiance, Clara shone her flashlight directly into his eyes. He recoiled, momentarily blinded, and in that split second, Ruth grabbed Clara's arm. "This way!" she screamed, pulling her towards a gap in the back wall of the barn, a place where the boards had rotted away. They scrambled through the opening, thorns and splintered wood tearing at their clothes. They were outside, in the thick brush that bordered the river. Behind them, they heard Whitmore shout in rage. They half ran, half stumbled through the darkness, Clara's injured ankle screaming with every lurching step. The sound of the river was getting louder, a roaring in the darkness. As they burst through the tree line, they saw why. The storm from the other night had flooded the river. It was a churning brown torrent, far higher and faster than normal. And then they heard another sound, the creak of heavy hinges. Looking back, they saw Whitmore emerging from the barn, but he wasn't coming after them. He was walking towards the large main doors of the barn. With a grunt of effort, he slammed them shut and dropped a heavy wooden bar into place, locking them. He wasn't trying to lock them in, he was trying to lock something else out. For a confusing, terrifying moment, they didn't understand. Then Clara saw the water. A muddy wave was surging over the riverbank, spreading rapidly across the low-lying field, heading directly for the barn, and for them. He wasn't just trying to kill them. He was trying to wash the evidence away. He was locking the barn to trap them on the wrong side, between his own evil and the unforgiving power of nature. They were caught in a death trap of his own design. As the first wave of cold, muddy water swirled around Clara's cast, she knew this was the end. She looked at the old barn, now a dark fortress, and at the rising floodwaters, and she understood the true, monstrous depth of Whitmore's evil. He wouldn't even have to dirty his hands. The river would do his work for him. The evidence, and the two women who had found it, would be washed away, buried in mud, gone forever. The roar of the surging river was deafening, a relentless, guttural growl that drowned out Clara's own cries of despair. The icy water, thick with mud and debris, swirled around her broken ankle, the force of the current threatening to rip her off her feet. Ruth, with a strength Clara didn't know she possessed, clung to her, pulling them both higher onto the muddy bank, away from the immediate surge. Above them, Gerald Whitmore stood by the newly barred barn doors, a triumphant, almost gleeful sneer twisting his lips. He raised the tire iron in a mock salute, his eyes glittering with cold malice, before turning and calmly walking back to his car. He left them to the mercy of the rising floodwaters, his exit deliberate, confident. He had committed the perfect crime, twice. He hadn't just removed the evidence, he had removed the witnesses. He would drive away, leaving them to drown, and no one would ever be the wiser. The rage that erupted in Clara was pure and visceral, a primal scream of fury against this man, This monster who thought he could simply wipe out lives and memories without consequence. "He's leaving us to die," Clara gasped, the words choked with mud and disbelief. The bitter truth hit her with the force of the current. It wasn't enough for him to conceal the past. He had to destroy anyone who threatened his perfect half-century-old lie. Her rage, usually a slow burn, was now a bonfire, fueling a desperate surge of adrenaline that temporarily dulled the screaming agony in her ankle. Ruth, her face a pale mask of terror, gripped Clara's arm so tightly it hurt. "We have to get back to the car," she screamed over the deluge, her voice hoarse. "Our phone." "We called the county office for the silo. They'll have Ruth's cell phone number from then. We told them our check-in for this trip would be an emergency contact to Gerald. If we call Gerald from her phone, and the contact for him in her phone shows County Commissioner Whitmore, it will link him to our previous locations if we don't call back and check out of a safe location in time." The thought, cold and clear amidst the panic, sparked a tiny ember of hope. The system they had put in place for their safety was now their last desperate chance. But the car was a quarter-mile away, across treacherous, flood-prone fields. With Clara's ankle, it was an impossible distance. Clara shook her head, her gaze fixed on the menacing shape of the barred barn. "He's not just trying to drown us," she said, her voice strained. "He's trying to drown what's inside that barn. There's more." Jacob marked other barns for a reason. The desperation in her eyes was a mixture of fear and conviction. "We have to get in there." Ruth stared at her, horrified. "Are you insane? He just tried to murder us. The water is rising." "He thinks we're trapped outside," Clara insisted, clinging to the only viable plan. "If we can get back inside, maybe there's another way out. And we might find more evidence." It was a terrible, reckless decision, born of a stubborn refusal to be defeated and a desperate gambler's last throw of the dice. Ruth, her face a storm of conflicting emotions, fear for her friend, anger at Whitmore, and a burgeoning righteous fury of her own, finally nodded. "How?" she shouted, the water now almost up to their knees. With the combined strength of their adrenaline-fueled terror, they hauled themselves up the riverbank, slogging through thick, sucking mud. Clara pointed to an old, half-submerged lumber pile nearby. "We need something to batter the door." The raw effort to find something substantial, something to break through the heavy bar Whitmore had dropped into place, was immense. The current tugged at them, threatening to drag them into the river. Finally, they found a thick, heavy plank, waterlogged and slippery. Every step back towards the barn was an agonizing struggle against the rising water and Clara's screaming ankle. They reached the large, double barn doors, the wooden bar, a mocking barrier. The floodwaters were already lapping at the bottom of the doors, rising fast. 1, 2, 3. Ruth screamed, and together they slammed the plank into the wooden bar. The impact vibrated through them, jarring every bone in Clara's injured leg. The bar groaned, but held. Again. Again. On the third strike, with a splintering crack that sounded like the bone snap of an old building, the bar gave way. The doors burst inward, revealing the dark, cavernous space, now eerily calm compared to the roaring inferno outside. The floodwaters surged past them, flowing into the barn, transforming its floor into a shallow, muddy lake. They stumbled inside, half drowning, and quickly slammed the heavy doors shut behind them, throwing the shattered remains of the wooden bar and a few loose timbers against them for whatever meager protection they could offer. Safe for now, from the flood, but not from Whitmore, and certainly not from the gnawing fear that he knew everything they knew. In the pitch black, only the muffled sound of the rain against the roof could be heard, and the terrifying echo of their own ragged breaths. Clara pulled out her flashlight, its weak beam slicing through the darkness. The barn was now an island surrounded by water, the silence inside even more oppressive after the storm. They had to be quick. Whitmore wouldn't be far away, probably watching from the road, confident the river would do his dirty work. He wouldn't risk coming down to the river himself, not until the water receded. Ruth, still trembling, began frantically searching, her hands tearing through piles of rotten hay. "He didn't want the river to reach this barn, Clara," Ruth gasped, pointing to something near the stone foundation. "Look!" Her flashlight beam landed on a smaller, sturdier wooden crate, tucked away in a surprisingly dry alcove, higher up from the flood's reach. It was a sturdy, old-fashioned toolbox, painted a dull gray. Clara hobbled towards it, every movement a fresh stab of pain in her ankle. She fumbled with the clasp. It opened with a click that echoed loudly in the dark. Inside, nestled among old tools and rusted bolts, was not a hidden compartment, but something else entirely. Wrapped in a grease-stained cloth were stacks of envelopes, personal letters. With a tremor, Clara pulled one out. It was addressed to Evelyn Henderson in elegant, flowing script, and inside, a faded, crumpled document. It was a certified letter, a legal warning, threatening foreclosure on the Henderson farm, but not for missing payments to the county. It was a threat from a private, unnamed entity, dated just weeks before the family vanished. This changed everything. Whitmore's motive from the ledger, the defaulted loan to the county, had been a smokescreen. The true, hidden truth was far more insidious, a deeper, darker financial conspiracy. He hadn't killed them over an overdue county loan. He had used the county system to set them up, to put them in a position where their farm could be taken from them by someone else entirely. The extent of his depravity was shocking. He hadn't just silenced the family. He had stolen their very land, their livelihood, orchestrating it from the shadows. He hadn't just benefited. He was the orchestrator of an elaborate betrayal. This revelation filled Clara with a cold, pure anger. He was not just corrupt, he was evil. He had used his power, not just to steal, but to destroy. As Ruth helped her carefully rewrap the evidence, securing it in a dry corner of the toolbox, they heard it, the unmistakable thrum of a car engine. And then the headlights. Not from the laneway, but through the broken window on the far side of the barn, illuminating the water flowing into the building. Whitmore was back. He hadn't given up. He was circling, hunting. "He heard us break in," Clara whispered, her blood running cold. "He knows we're still here." They scrambled back into the relative concealment of a collapsed hayloft, barely large enough for them both, the sounds of Whitmore's car now dangerously close. The engine cut out, and the familiar crunch of his expensive shoes on the gravel outside filled the terrified silence. They heard his heavy footsteps by the barn doors, testing them. He rattled the broken bar, muttered a curse under his breath. Then, the rhythmic scraping sound of metal against wood, growing closer. He was prying at the boards, trying to open the small side window they had used to escape. Clara held her breath. The Henderson lunchbox clutched to her chest. Ruth was shaking, her hand reaching for Clara's, a desperate, silent plea. This was it. There was no escaping. They had walked right back into his trap. The scraping stopped. They heard him grunting, trying to force the weakened wood. And then, the unmistakable sound of a phone ringing. Whitmore's phone. He swore again, the sound muffled. They heard his voice, curt and angry, talking to someone on the phone. He was leaving. He got back in his car, slammed the door, and the engine roared to life. His headlights cut across the broken window again, then receded, vanishing into the night. He was gone, a reprieve. But not an escape. They were safe for now, but only because something else, something outside their control, had pulled him away. The adrenaline receded, leaving Clara weak and trembling, her ankles screaming in protest. They were still trapped, still in danger. The rising waters, the broken doors, the unknown reason for Whitmore's sudden departure, it all combined to create a sense of profound, unsettling dread. This game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They had gained new evidence, but they were no closer to being truly free. What had pulled Whitmore away, and what new threat did that unexpected call represent? Clara looked at the muddy water rising inside the barn, and she knew. Their next move had to be carefully planned. This was a battle, and they had just escaped with their lives, but the war for truth was far from over. The real danger wasn't just in the barn, it was everywhere. The escape from the Riverbend barn was a blur of mud, pain, and the lingering metallic taste of fear. Whitmore's sudden departure had been a miracle, a baffling reprieve that they didn't dare question. They had waited until the first hint of dawn before making their way back to the car, the floodwaters having receded just enough to make the fields a treacherous, swampy marsh. The journey back to town was silent. The artifacts, the lunchbox, the ledger, the photos, a heavy, sacred weight on the seat between them. They weren't just two women driving home. They were guardians of a story, protectors of 5 stolen lives. The weight of that responsibility was immense, a crushing burden that left no room for the relief that should have followed their escape. They had the evidence. They had the motive. They had survived a murder attempt. The pieces were all there. But the final, terrifying piece was the man himself. How do you stop a monster who holds all the power, who has gotten away with it for 50 years? Clara, now operating on a cocktail of coffee, adrenaline, and pure, stubborn will, knew they had only one move left. They couldn't go to the local authorities. That was Whitmore's kingdom. They had to go over his head, to the state police. But they couldn't just walk in with a box of rusted artifacts and a wild story. They needed to force his hand, to corner him so completely that even his web of influence and intimidation couldn't save him. This was where Clara made her most reckless decision yet, a move born from a lifetime of understanding the small-town mind. She decided to use the one weapon Whitmore had wielded against her so effectively: gossip. She gave the foreclosure letters and a copy of the ledger to Ruth. Ruth, in turn, leaked them to her most trusted gossip-loving second cousin who worked at the county courthouse. By noon, the whispers had started. By 3 o'clock, they were aroar. The story, now twisted and embellished by the town's rumor mill, was that Gerald Whitmore, the beloved county commissioner, had been involved in a shady land deal that had ruined the Hendersons. The seeds of doubt had been planted. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Whitmore's carefully constructed legacy began to crack. The town, which had so willingly shunned Clara, now turned its suspicious gaze on its leader. The silence he had commanded for so long was finally broken. That evening, as Clara sat in her living room, her injured leg propped up, the phone rang. It was him. "You've made a terrible mistake," he hissed, his voice no longer smooth or controlled, but ragged with a fury he could barely contain. "You have no idea what you're meddling in." "It's over, Gerald," Clara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "People know. It's only a matter of time." There was a long, chilling pause. "Meet me," he said, the words a low, dangerous command. "My office, in 1 hour. We will discuss this. Alone." It was a trap, a blatant, obvious trap. Going to him on his territory alone was suicide. Ruth, on the other end of their now open phone line, was whispering frantically, "Don't go, Clara, don't go." But Clara knew she had to. This was the end game. If she backed down now, he would find a way to silence her, to discredit her, to make the story go away. She had to face him. It was her one and only chance to get the truth, the full truth. Clara hung up and looked at Ruth. "You're not going alone," Ruth said, her face pale but resolute. "We call the state police right now. We tell them everything. We tell them he's threatening you." "And what if they get here too late?" Clara countered, the grim logic of their situation hanging heavy in the air. "No, I'm going to go, but you are going to be my insurance." She laid out her plan, a desperate, dangerous gamble. Ruth would wait in the car, parked across the street from the county building. She would have her phone, ready to call the state police dispatcher the second Clara sent a prearranged text message. If Clara wasn't out in exactly 20 minutes, Ruth was to make the call, trap or no trap. It was a flimsy shield against a man who had already tried to kill her, but it was the only one they had. Walking into the darkened, empty county building felt like stepping into her own mausoleum. The silence of the long marble hallways was deafening. Whitmore's office was at the very end, the door slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling out. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, a silhouette against the large window that overlooked the town square. He didn't rise when she entered. The air in the room was thick with a palpable hatred. "You foolish woman," he began, his voice a low growl. "You think you've won? You think a few pieces of paper can undo 50 years of order?" He stood up and began to pace, his movements like those of a caged tiger. "I admired Jacob Henderson," he said, the words startling Clara. "He was a good farmer, an honest man. But he was stubborn. He wouldn't listen to reason." He stopped pacing and turned to her, his face a mask of self-righteous justification. He discovered something he shouldn't have, a misuse of county funds. Not just by me, by several of us. It was how things were done back then. to keep the town running. He was going to expose us all, bring the whole system crashing down. Order had to be kept. His confession was chillingly devoid of remorse. He spoke of destroying a family as if it were a necessary act of civic maintenance. The depth of his villainy, the cold-blooded pragmatism of it, was more monstrous than she could have ever imagined. He sneered, a look of utter contempt on his face. No one cared then. Why should they care now? You've upset the balance, Clara, for nothing. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. Your father knew, he said, savoring the words, watching the impact they had on her. Oh, he didn't help. He wasn't one of us, but he was impressionable. He understood the need for order. We explained the situation to him. We explained that if he continued his investigation, it would destroy the town, and it might put his own family in danger. Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her father, her hero. He hadn't been a failed investigator. He had been a coward. He had been threatened, and he had chosen silence. He had chosen to protect himself, and her, at the expense of the Hendersons. It was a betrayal so profound it threatened to shatter her. The note her mother had hidden, "Check the well," wasn't a clue for her father. It was an act of rebellion against him. Her mother had suspected the truth, suspected her husband's complicity, but she could never prove it. She had been trapped in a silent prison of her own, a witness to her husband's moral failure. He lived with that fear his whole life, Whitmore said, a cruel twist to his lips. Every day, just like you're going to live with it now. He stepped towards her, his intentions clear in the cold deadness of his eyes. Just as he reached for her, the office door burst open. Standing there were two state troopers, their faces grim, their hands on their holstered weapons. Behind them stood Ruth, her phone still clutched in her hand, her face a mixture of terror and triumphant relief. She hadn't waited for the text. She had seen Whitmore's car parked behind the building, had seen him get out with the tire iron, and had made the call. She had saved Clara's life. Whitmore stared at the troopers, his face crumbling from rage into stunned disbelief. It was over. The lie, the order he had killed to protect for 50 years, had finally come crashing down. As the troopers slapped handcuffs on his wrists, his eyes found Clara's. They held no remorse, no regret. Only a deep, bottomless well of pure hatred. The monster was caught. Justice, it seemed, was finally being served. But as Clara leaned against the doorframe, the truth about her father a fresh, gaping wound in her heart, she knew this was no simple victory. The cost of this justice had been immense, and the scars would last a lifetime.